Black American soldier prepared to lose his leg. What Japanese POW's surgeon did next changed medicine forever. October 23, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, Peleliu Island, Palau. Sergeant James Lawson felt the explosion before he heard it. The Japanese mortar shell landed 3 feet from his foxhole, and the blast wave lifted him like a child's toy, slamming him against a shattered palm tree. When the ringing in his ears subsided enough to think, he looked down at his left leg and saw bone. The 26-year-old soldier from Detroit had survived 3 island campaigns. He had walked through Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal, dodged snipers on New Georgia, and earned a Purple Heart on Bougainville. But this morning, watching blood pool in the volcanic sand beneath him, Jimmy Lawson knew his war was over. The tibial bone protruded through torn muscle at an angle that made him look away. His boot sat 5 feet distant, still laced, the foot inside pointing the wrong direction. Private Sam Carter reached him first, sliding into the crater with a morphine syringe already uncapped. The medic took one look at the leg, and his face went pale beneath 3 days of combat grime. He injected the morphine without speaking, then wrapped the wound with gauze that turned red before he finished tying it. Behind them, the 121st Infantry Regiment was being torn apart by Japanese machine gun fire from the Brogel ridges. The caves and coral fortifications had turned Peleliu into a killing ground that consumed American lives at a rate that shocked even hardened Pacific veterans. By noon, Jimmy drifted in and out of consciousness on a stretcher. The morphine created strange dreams where his mother's kitchen in Detroit merged with the smoking ruins around him. He woke to find himself on a beach where the wounded lay in rows, waiting for boats that might never come. The Navy had promised evacuation, but Japanese artillery controlled the landing zones. Men died waiting. 3 days later, on October 26th, the impossible happened. A Japanese counterattack overran the field hospital. Jimmy woke to the sound of shouting in a language he didn't understand, and the sight of enemy soldiers moving between the stretchers. He tried to reach for his rifle, then remembered he had no rifle. He had nothing but a destroyed leg and a body too weak to stand. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now, back to the story. The Japanese soldier who found him was young, maybe 19, with dirt-stained uniform and eyes that had seen too much. He pointed his Arisaka rifle at Jimmy's chest, finger on the trigger, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, Jimmy waited for the bullet. Instead, the soldier lowered the weapon, called to his comrades, and 4 men lifted the stretcher. The journey inland took hours. Japanese soldiers carried American wounded through jungle, trails, past destroyed bunkers and mass graves where both armies had left their dead. Jimmy counted 63 American prisoners, most wounded, all expecting execution. He had heard the stories from Bataan, from Wake Island, from a dozen Pacific battles where surrender meant death. The Japanese did not take prisoners. Everyone knew this. They arrived at a compound built into a limestone cave system as darkness fell. Japanese guards herded the Americans into a wire enclosure where 200 prisoners already waited. The camp commandant, a lieutenant whose name Jimmy would later learn was Tanaka, walked among them with an interpreter, counting, documenting, verifying. It felt wrong. It felt like organization. It felt like they intended to keep these men alive. That night, lying on bare ground with his ruined leg throbbing despite the morphine, Jimmy Lawson prepared himself for whatever came next. He had survived the blast, survived the capture, survived the march. Now he would survive imprisonment, or he would die trying. What he could not have known, what none of them could have imagined, was that survival would come from the most unexpected source, and it would cost him everything he thought he knew about enemies and friends. October 27th, 1944. Dawn. The Japanese medical officer arrived as morning light filtered through the cave entrance. Dr. Hiroshi Takeda was 42 years old. Thin from months of inadequate rations, his surgical skills learned at Tokyo Imperial University now applied in conditions that would have horrified his professors. He moved through the American wounded with 2 assistants, examining, documenting, making decisions that determined who lived and who died. When Takeda reached Jimmy's stretcher, he stopped. The leg had swollen to twice its normal size, the flesh around the compound fracture turning colors that belonged in a butcher's window, not on a living man. Infection had set in, despite the sulfanilamide powder the American medics had used. The standard treatment was obvious: amputation. Remove the limb, save the life. Takeda had performed 43 amputations since arriving at Peleliu in September. He knew the procedure intimately. Jimmy watched the Japanese doctor's face, trying to read intention in expressions shaped by a culture he didn't understand. Takeda spoke to his assistants in rapid Japanese, gesturing at the leg, and Jimmy caught the word that sounded like amputation in any language. He tried to speak, to protest, but weakness and dehydration had reduced his voice to a whisper. Sam Carter, lying on the adjacent stretcher with shrapnel wounds across his back, reached over to grip Jimmy's hand. Then something unexpected happened. Takeda knelt beside the stretcher, his face level with Jimmy's, and in careful, accented English said, "American soldier, your leg is badly damaged. Infection is spreading. Standard treatment is amputation. You understand?" Jimmy managed a nod. This was it. They would take his leg in a cave on a Pacific island, and if he survived the surgery without anesthesia or proper instruments, he would go home a cripple. If he survived at all. Takeda continued, still kneeling, his voice low and careful. "I was prisoner in America, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, 2 years. I saw how Americans treat prisoners. I saw doctors work to save German soldiers, not just keep them alive, but restore them. I learned different way." The doctor stood, called his assistants, and began issuing orders. What followed over the next hour defied every expectation Jimmy had carried into captivity. Takeda cleaned the wound with precious supplies of antiseptic, debrided the dead tissue with surgical precision, and set the bone using a technique Jimmy would later learn was called external fixation. The doctor fashioned a frame from salvaged metal, drilled pins through healthy bone above and below the break, and stabilized the leg in a way that allowed the tissue to heal while preventing the bone from shifting. The pain was extraordinary. Jimmy bit through a leather strap they placed in his mouth and felt consciousness slip away twice, but each time he woke, Takeda was still working. The Japanese doctor operated with the concentration of a man performing surgery in a modern hospital, not a prisoner treating an enemy in a cave. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and when he finally stepped back 3 hours later, the leg was stable, clean, and positioned to heal. Takeda looked down at Jimmy, and in that moment, something passed between them that neither man could have articulated. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was recognition. The doctor saw a soldier who wanted to live. The soldier saw a healer who had chosen mercy over expedience. "You will keep your leg," Takeda said. "But you must fight infection, must eat, must stay strong. The leg is saved, but you must save yourself." Jimmy tried to thank him, but Takeda had already moved to the next patient, a 19-year-old private from Nebraska whose arm had been shattered by machine gun fire. Jimmy watched the doctor work, watched him make the same choice, pursue the same careful reconstruction rather than quick amputation. This was not an isolated act of kindness. This was philosophy. This was principle. Sam Carter whispered from the adjacent stretcher, his voice hoarse with shock. "Did that just happen? Did a Jap doctor just save your leg?" Jimmy stared at the metal frame now protruding from his limb, at the careful stitching that closed the wound, at the evidence of skill and care that contradicted everything he thought he knew. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, he did." November 1st, 1944. The infection came anyway. Despite Takeda's surgery, despite the careful cleaning and the metal frame holding bone in place, Jimmy's body began to fail. Fever spiked to 104 degrees. The leg swelled again, the tissue around the pins turning angry red, and by the second day of November, Jimmy was delirious. He dreamed of Detroit, of his mother's kitchen where she made cornbread every Sunday, of the Ford factory where his father worked the assembly line for 30 years before his heart gave out. He dreamed of Margaret, his girl who wrote him letters that arrived months late, filled with news of a world that seemed impossibly distant. In his fever, she was standing at the end of his hospital bed, but when he reached for her, she dissolved into smoke. Takeda came 3 times daily, checking the wound, adjusting the frame, administering what little medicine the camp possessed. On November 3rd, the doctor arrived with something new, a small vial of yellowish powder that he mixed with water and injected directly into the tissue around the infection. Jimmy was conscious enough to see the Japanese characters on the label, to understand this was not standard medical supply. "Penicillin," Takeda said quietly. "From American supply dump, captured last week. I saved for worst cases." He met Jimmy's eyes directly. "You are worst case." The question rose unbidden through Jimmy's fever. "Why?" His voice was barely audible. "Why save it for me?" Takeda sat on the edge of the stretcher, a breach of military protocol that would have earned him punishment if Lieutenant Tanaka had seen it. "In Wisconsin, I had infection. Pneumonia. American doctors used penicillin. They explained how it works, how it was developed. They treated enemy doctor same as American soldier." He paused, choosing words carefully. "They showed me that medicine has no nationality. Suffering is suffering. Healing is healing." Over the next 48 hours, Jimmy's fever broke. The infection retreated. The tissue around the pins began to look human again rather than necrotic. On November 6th, he was able to sit up without help, to drink water without vomiting, to think clearly for the first time in days. The leg was still damaged, still painful, but it was healing. Sam Carter, now recovering from his own wounds, watched this transformation with increasing confusion. "I don't get it," he said one evening as they shared a portion of rice and dried fish that passed for dinner. "Everything they told us about the Japs, about how they don't value life, how they're savages. But that doctor, he's saving lives like it matters." Jimmy had been thinking about this constantly. 26 years of learning to hate, to fear, to categorize entire peoples as less than human. His drill instructors at basic training had called them monkeys, animals, vermin to be exterminated. The newsreels showed Japanese atrocities, and they were real. He had seen the aftermath of Japanese attacks, had helped bury Marines who had been tortured before execution. None of that was propaganda. None of that was lies. But now he was alive because a Japanese doctor had chosen to save him, had used precious medicine, limited supplies, and personal risk to preserve the leg of an enemy soldier. The contradiction sat in his mind like a stone in his boot, impossible to ignore. Maybe, Jimmy said slowly, maybe they're not all the same. Maybe some of them are just soldiers like us, following orders, trying to survive. Maybe some of them hate this war as much as we do. Sam was quiet for a long moment. That's dangerous thinking. Makes it harder to kill them. Yeah, Jimmy agreed. It does. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, Jimmy watched Takeda work by lamplight at the far end of the cave. The doctor was operating on a Japanese soldier, not an American, using the same careful technique, the same concentration. There was no difference in his approach. Enemy or ally, wounded was wounded, and the doctor's obligation was to heal. Jimmy realized he was crying, tears running down his face in the darkness, though he couldn't have explained why. Somewhere in his fevered recovery, something had broken inside him. Some wall he had built to protect himself from seeing the enemy as human had developed cracks, and through those cracks came light he wasn't sure he wanted to see. November 12th, 1944. Jimmy could stand now, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch carved from bamboo, but standing nonetheless. The leg held his weight. The external fixation frame still protruded from flesh, the pins still entered bone, but beneath the metal and surgical wire, healing was happening. When Takeda examined the wound that morning, he nodded with what might have been satisfaction. "Bone is setting correctly," the doctor said. "In 3 months, maybe 4, we can remove the frame. You will walk again. Not like before, but you will walk." That afternoon, Jimmy stood near the cave entrance, breathing fresh air for the first time in weeks. The compound occupied a limestone ridge overlooking the Pacific, and from this elevation, he could see the ocean stretching to the horizon. Somewhere beyond that water was home, was America, was a life he increasingly doubted he would see again. Lieutenant Tanaka appeared in the entrance, accompanied by 2 guards and a prisoner, an American private who couldn't have been older than 18. The boy's face was bruised, his uniform torn, and his hands were tied behind his back. Tanaka shoved him forward, speaking rapidly in Japanese to the guards, gesturing at the punishment post that stood in the compound's center. Jimmy understood enough from tone and gesture to know what was coming. Minor infractions earned beatings. This was standard practice in military prisons, Japanese or otherwise. But something about the boy's face, the terror in his eyes, the way he was shaking, made Jimmy's stomach turn. Takeda emerged from the medical area, saw the scene, and immediately stepped forward. What followed was an argument in Japanese that Jimmy couldn't fully understand, but the body language was clear. Takeda was objecting. Tanaka was insisting. The 2 men stood face to face, voices rising, and other Japanese soldiers stopped their duties to watch. Finally, Tanaka switched to English, perhaps for the benefit of the American prisoners who had gathered to watch. "You forget yourself, Doctor. This prisoner attempted to steal food. Theft requires punishment." "The Geneva Convention," Takeda began. "The Geneva Convention is a Western document for Western wars," Tanaka interrupted. "This is the Pacific. Different rules." "No." Takeda's voice was quiet but firm. "I was prisoner in America. They followed the Geneva Convention. They treated prisoners with dignity. We can do the same." Tanaka's hand moved to his sword, and the temperature in the compound dropped. For a moment, Jimmy thought the lieutenant would strike the doctor down. Instead, Tanaka spoke in a voice like ice. You were captured. You surrendered. In Japan, this brings shame to your family for 7 generations. You have no honor to speak of these things. Takeda's face went pale, but he held his ground. I have the honor of a doctor. I have the oath I took at university. I will not stand silent while you violate the standards of civilized warfare. The silence that followed was absolute. Every prisoner, every guard, every man in that compound understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. A Japanese officer was defying his superior, invoking Western values, choosing principle over obedience. In the Imperial Japanese Army, such defiance could mean death. Tanaka stared at Takeda for what felt like minutes. Then he released the boy's arm, shoved him toward the guards, and spoke rapid Japanese. The guards untied the prisoner and led him back to the holding area. No beating, no punishment post. The lieutenant turned back to Takeda and said something in Japanese that made every Japanese soldier present stiffen. As Tanaka walked away, Takeda stood alone in the compound center, his hands trembling slightly. The cost of his defiance was written in the faces of the other Japanese soldiers. They looked at him with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust to something that might have been admiration. San Carter whispered to Jimmy, "What just happened?" Jimmy leaned on his crutch, watching Takeda walk slowly back to the medical area, his shoulders squared, but his gait uncertain. He just saved that kid's life, and maybe ruined his own. That night, Jimmy couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the scene, the argument, the moment when Takeda had invoked the Geneva Convention like it was scripture. The doctor had been a prisoner in America. He had seen how Americans treated their captives, and from that experience, he had built a philosophy that now placed him at odds with his own command, his own culture, his own army. The wall inside Jimmy cracked wider. November 28, 1944. Thanksgiving Day in America, though no one in the cave knew or cared about American holidays. For Jimmy Lawson, the day marked 1 month since Takeda had saved his leg, and 5 weeks since he had started the slow climb back from the edge of death. The external fixation frame was still there, still painful, but the infection was gone. The bone was healing. Against every expectation, every probability, he was recovering. He could walk now, slow and halting, using the bamboo crutch to take weight off the healing leg. Each morning he forced himself to stand, to move, to rebuild strength that had melted away during his fevered weeks. Takeda watched these efforts with what might have been approval, occasionally offering advice on positioning, on weight distribution, on the careful balance between rehabilitation and re-injury. But as Jimmy's body healed, his mind fractured. He lay awake at night on the thin mat that served as bedding, staring at the cave ceiling, wrestling with contradictions that had no resolution. Everything he believed about the Japanese, about the enemy, about good and evil in this war, had been built on a foundation of absolute moral clarity. America was liberating the Pacific from Japanese tyranny. The Japanese were brutal occupiers who committed atrocities across Asia. This was a clear fight between civilization and barbarism. But then there was Takeda, a man who had chosen to save Jimmy's leg when amputation would have been easier, faster, safer. A man who had used precious penicillin on an enemy soldier. A man who had defied his commanding officer to prevent the beating of an American prisoner. None of this fit the narrative. None of this made sense. "You're thinking too much," Sam Carter said one evening, noticing Jimmy's silence. "I can hear you thinking from over here." "I can't figure him out," Jimmy admitted. "The doctor. Why does he care? Why risk himself for us? Sam shrugged, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing back. Maybe he's one of the good ones. Every army has them. Doesn't change what the rest of them do. But that answer didn't satisfy. Jimmy had seen the other Japanese soldiers watching Takeda with a mixture of respect and resentment. The doctor was not an anomaly. He was a reminder of something they had lost, some code of honor that had been eroded by years of brutal warfare. His presence made them uncomfortable because it reflected something they could not acknowledge. On the morning of November 30th, Takeda examined Jimmy's leg and announced that healing was progressing well. In 2 more months, we remove the frame. You will have scar, will have limp, but you will walk. The doctor paused, then added something he had never said before. I am glad I could save it. In this war, we lose so much. Every life saved, every limb preserved. It is victory against the waste. Jimmy found his voice. Why were you captured? In America, you said. How did that happen? Takeda sat back, considering whether to answer. Finally, he spoke quietly. I was medical officer on transport ship, December 1941, 1 week after Pearl Harbor. American submarine torpedoed us off Hawaii. I survived. Most did not. I spent 2 years at Camp McCoy, learning that everything my government told me about Americans was lies. They were not soft. They were not weak. They were not cruel. They were soldiers doing their duty, same as us. But you came back, Jimmy said. Prisoner exchange. You could have stayed. Could have refused repatriation. Japan is my country, Takeda said simply. My family is there. My honor required return. But I brought with me what I learned. I brought new way of seeing. That night, Jimmy dreamed of his father, the old man who had worked the assembly line at Ford for 3 decades, who had taught Jimmy that a man's worth was measured in his work, in his integrity, in the care he showed to others. In the dream, his father looked at him with disappointment and said, You're learning the wrong lessons, son. You're supposed to hate them. Jimmy woke in darkness, his heart pounding. The cave was quiet, except for the breathing of sleeping men and the distant sound of waves against the shore. Somewhere in this darkness, Takeda was sleeping, a man who had chosen compassion over expedience, mercy over duty, healing over harm. And Jimmy, who had arrived at this camp prepared to die hating his captors, now found himself unable to sustain that hatred in the face of one man's principled kindness. The worst part, the part that kept him awake as false dawn lightened the cave entrance, was the guilt. Guilt for the anger he had once felt toward all Japanese. Guilt for the dehumanization he had participated in. The casual racism that had made it easier to kill. Guilt for surviving when so many others had died. And deepest of all, guilt for feeling gratitude toward a man whose country had killed his friends, had started this war, had brought all of them to this terrible place. Sam Carter's voice came from the darkness. You still awake? Yeah. Me too. A pause. We're going to survive this, Jimmy. We're going to go home. And when we do, what are you going to tell people about this? About him? Jimmy thought about that question for a long time. Finally, he said, I'm going to tell them the truth. That the enemy saved my life. And that truth is more complicated than we ever wanted to believe. December 8th, 1944. 3 years to the day since Pearl Harbor. The anniversary meant nothing to the men in the cave, but it meant everything to the guards. Lieutenant Tanaka ordered formation at dawn, made the American prisoners stand in the compound while he read a speech in Japanese about honor and sacrifice. Jimmy stood on his healing leg, the bamboo crutch taking most of his weight, and watched Takeda translate the lieutenant's words into halting English. The doctor's face revealed nothing, but his voice carried a weight that the original speech lacked. When Tanaka spoke of glorious victories, Takeda translated it as battles fought. When Tanaka mentioned the cowardice of surrender, Takeda said only that prisoners had been taken. The subtle shifts in meaning were not lost on Jimmy, who had learned to read the doctor's careful diplomacy. After the formation dismissed, Takeda returned to the medical area where Jimmy now spent most of his time. The doctor had begun teaching him basic wound care, showing him how to clean the pins that still protruded from his leg, how to recognize signs of infection, how to change dressings with materials that were growing scarcer by the day. These lessons felt like something more than practical instruction. They felt like conversation without words. "Tell me about Detroit," Takeda said that afternoon while examining another patient. The question came without preamble, without context, just a simple request that caught Jimmy off guard. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Your home, your family, what you did before the war." Takeda finished bandaging the patient's arm and gestured for Jimmy to help the man back to his sleeping area. "We spend all our time treating bodies. Sometimes I forget people have lives beyond their wounds." So Jimmy talked. He described the brick house on John R. Street where his mother still lived, where he had grown up sharing a bedroom with two brothers. He talked about the neighborhood, how everyone knew everyone, how summer evenings meant sitting on the porch with neighbors while kids played stickball in the street. He described his father's calloused hands, permanently stained with factory oil, and how the old man had never missed a day of work in 30 years until his heart gave out on the assembly line. Takeda listened without interrupting, his hands continuing their work on other patients, but his attention fully focused. When Jimmy mentioned that he had wanted to be a teacher before the war, the doctor stopped and looked at him directly. "Why teacher?" "My mother cleaned houses for white families," Jimmy said. "She used to bring me books they threw away. I learned that words were power, that education was the only thing nobody could take from you." He paused, aware of the irony. "Except a war takes everything." "Not everything," Takeda said quietly. "You still have the desire to teach. That survived." The doctor began his own story. He spoke of growing up in Osaka, the son of a silk merchant who had wanted him to join the family business. He described Tokyo Imperial University, the grinding years of medical training, the pride of graduation. He talked about his wife, Yuki, and their two daughters, who he had not seen in 3 years. His voice cracked slightly when he mentioned that his youngest daughter had been 4 years old when he left, and would be 7 now, a stranger. "Do they know you're alive?" Jimmy asked. "I send letters through Red Cross. Sometimes they arrive, sometimes I receive answers. Mostly, I do not know." Takeda returned to his work, but his movements had lost their usual precision. "My wife's last letter said our neighborhood was bombed. American B-29s. She wrote that she understood why, that she did not blame the Americans. She blamed the men who started this war." The weight of that statement hung between them. Here was a Japanese doctor whose family had been bombed by American aircraft, treating American soldiers with care that exceeded medical necessity. The contradiction was staggering. Sam Carter, listening from his mat nearby, spoke for the first time. "Doc, why'd you come back? After your exchange, you could have stayed in America." Takeda was quiet for a long moment. "Because Japan is my home. Because my family is there." Because running from difficulty is not the answer. He met Sam's eyes. But I came back changed. I came back knowing that the enemy was not what they told us. And I cannot unknow that truth. December 15th, 1944. The supplies were running low. Even Jimmy, who knew nothing about military logistics, could see it in the way the guards counted every grain of rice, every scrap of dried fish. The prisoners had been eating one small meal per day for weeks. Now that meal was getting smaller. Takeda's medical supplies were almost gone. The last of the penicillin had been used to save Jimmy's leg. The sulfa drugs were depleted. The bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. The doctor was performing surgery with tools that belonged in a museum, using techniques that predated modern medicine, making decisions that would have horrified his professors at Tokyo Imperial University. Jimmy watched him work with increasing admiration. When the doctor had no anesthetic, he used acupressure points to reduce pain. When he had no surgical suture, he used boiled plant fibers. When he had no antiseptic, he used salt water boiled until it was sterile. Each improvisation was a small miracle of adaptation, a refusal to let scarcity defeat his purpose. "You're a magician," Jimmy said one afternoon, watching Takeda construct a splint from bamboo and strips of cloth torn from an old uniform. "I am a doctor with no supplies," Takeda corrected. "The magic would be having actual medicine." But there was a hint of pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a craftsman who had overcome impossible limitations. That evening, Corporal Takashi Kato approached the medical area. The young Japanese soldier was barely 20, with a face that still held traces of boyish softness despite months of combat. He had been watching Takeda's work with increasing interest, and now he carried something wrapped in cloth. He spoke rapidly in Japanese, and Takeda's eyebrows rose in surprise. The doctor unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small medical kit, Japanese military issue, containing bandages, antiseptic, and several ampules of morphine. Kato explained in broken English that he had traded his personal belongings to another unit for the supplies. "Why?" Takeda asked, switching to English so Jimmy could understand. Kato struggled with the words. "You save everyone. Japanese, American, not different. This is correct way." He bowed slightly and left before Takeda could respond. Jimmy saw the doctor's hands shake as he carefully inventoried the supplies. It was the first time he had seen Takeda display visible emotion beyond his careful professional mask. The implications were staggering. A Japanese soldier had sacrificed his own possessions to help his doctor treat enemy prisoners. The chain of compassion was spreading. "There are good men everywhere," Takeda said quietly. "Even in the middle of hell, goodness survives." That night, Jimmy lay awake thinking about Kato's gesture. The young corporal represented something that Jimmy's training had taught him was impossible. He was a Japanese soldier who had chosen mercy over duty, compassion over obedience. He was proof that the categories Jimmy had relied on, the clean divisions between us and them, good and evil, friend and enemy, were far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Sam Carter's voice came from the darkness. "Did you see that? That Jap soldier bringing supplies?" "His name is Kato," Jimmy said. "And yeah, I saw it." "This place is making my head hurt," Sam admitted. "Every time I think I got it figured out, something happens that doesn't fit." Jimmy understood completely. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. How could you hate an enemy who was starving himself to give you medicine? How could you maintain rage against people who were suffering the same deprivations, fighting the same war from the other side? "Maybe that's the point," Jimmy said. "Maybe we're not supposed to figure it out." Maybe we're just supposed to see it. Takeda's voice joined theirs, speaking from his corner of the medical area. War makes everything simple. Kill the enemy. Follow orders. Do not question. But humans are not simple. We are complicated. We are contradictions. He paused. The man who finds complexity where propaganda promised simplicity has begun to think for himself. This is dangerous for governments, but it is necessary for souls. December 22nd, 1944. The morning brought unexpected news. A new group of prisoners arrived, 30 Marines captured during fighting on Leyte. They came in the same condition Jimmy had arrived in months earlier, wounded, exhausted, expecting brutality. Lieutenant Tanaka assigned them to the cave compound, and Takeda began the familiar process of triage, evaluation, and treatment. Jimmy watched the new prisoners react to the Japanese doctor with the same suspicion he had felt. He saw their faces when Takeda examined their wounds with gentle hands, when he used precious supplies to treat enemies, when he made the same choices that had saved Jimmy's leg. He recognized their confusion because he had lived it. One Marine, a corporal from Tennessee named Jackson, had a compound fracture similar to Jimmy's original injury. Takeda examined it, explained the options in careful English, and recommended the same external fixation technique he had used on Jimmy. Jackson stared at him with open distrust. "You're going to cut off my leg," Jackson said flatly. "I've heard what you people do to prisoners." Takeda didn't take offense. He simply showed Jackson the metal frame still visible on Jimmy's healing leg, explained the procedure, and waited. Jimmy found himself stepping forward, becoming an advocate for the doctor who had saved him. "Listen to me," Jimmy told Jackson. 3 months ago, I was where you are. Shattered leg, expecting the worst. This man saved my limb when amputation would have been easier. He used medicine he didn't have to spare. He put his own standing at risk to follow the Geneva Convention. You can trust him or not, but I'm walking because of him." Jackson looked between Jimmy and Takeda, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had been taught. Finally, he nodded consent. What followed over the next hours was familiar to Jimmy. The careful surgery, the improvised anesthesia, the metal frame taking shape around shattered bone. But this time, Jimmy assisted. He held instruments, passed supplies, learned by doing what Takeda had once only taught through demonstration. When the surgery was complete and Jackson was sedated with morphine from Cato's donated supplies, Takeda sat back, exhausted. His hands trembled from the precise work, from malnutrition that had reduced him to perhaps 130 pounds, from the accumulated stress of months of impossible conditions. "Why do you do this?" Jimmy asked. "You're Japanese. We're your enemies. Your country expects you to let us suffer." Takeda looked at him with eyes that held depths of weariness. "My country expects many things. It expects me to believe that you are subhuman. It expects me to feel no mercy. It expects me to forget my oath as a physician." He paused. "I cannot meet those expectations. If that makes me a traitor, then I am a traitor to cruelty. I can live with that." The truth of it struck Jimmy with physical force. Takeda was not just treating patients. He was waging his own private resistance against the dehumanization of war. Every surgery was an act of rebellion. Every life saved was a vote against the propaganda that had convinced entire nations to see other humans as less than human. "When I was captured," Takeda continued, "I thought my life was over. I thought I had dishonored my family, my country, my ancestors. Then I saw how Americans treated prisoners. They fed us. They housed us. They followed rules, even in war. And I understood that honor was not about dying for your country. It was about living according to principles that transcended nationality. That evening, the new prisoners and the old ones shared the small meal that constituted dinner. Jackson, still groggy from morphine, listened as other prisoners told him about life in the cave, about Takeda's daily miracles, about the small acts of human decency that had somehow survived in this place. And Jimmy saw the same transformation beginning in Jackson's eyes that had occurred in his own. The wall starting to crack, the certainty beginning to crumble, the enemy becoming human. January 3rd, 1945. Jimmy's leg was healing remarkably well. The external fixation frame still protruded from his flesh, but beneath the metal, the bone was knitting together. Takeda examined it each morning with satisfaction that approached joy. In 3 weeks, perhaps 4, they could remove the frame. Jimmy would walk again, properly walk, without the crutch that had been his constant companion for 3 months. But walking was becoming increasingly difficult for all of them. The food shortage had progressed from serious to critical. The single daily meal now consisted of a handful of rice and whatever protein could be scavenged. Fish, if the guards were lucky. Rats, if they were desperate. Sometimes nothing but the rice, and even that was stretching thinner each day. Jimmy had lost perhaps 40 pounds since capture. Sam Carter looked skeletal. The new prisoners, arriving already malnourished from combat, were deteriorating rapidly. But the Japanese guards were suffering equally. Kato's face had become gaunt, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost all excess weight. Even Lieutenant Tanaka showed signs of starvation, though he maintained rigid military discipline despite his body's decline. Only Takeda seemed immune to the hunger. He worked through it with the same careful precision he brought to surgery, never complaining, never slowing. Jimmy realized the doctor was giving away portions of his own rations, distributing food to patients who needed it more. The self-sacrifice was killing him by degrees. On the evening of January 3rd, something extraordinary happened. Jimmy was dozing on his mat when Takeda quietly approached and placed something beside him. In the dim light, Jimmy saw a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it to find a rice ball, larger than any meal he had received in weeks, with pieces of fish pressed into the center. "Where did you get this?" Jimmy whispered, aware that every eye in the cave would turn toward anyone eating extra food. "Eat," Takeda said simply. "You need strength for when we remove the frame. The bone is healing well, but your body needs nourishment to complete the process." "This is your ration," Jimmy realized. "You're giving me your food." "I am giving a patient what he needs to heal." Takeda's voice was firm. "Eat. That is an order from your doctor." Jimmy wanted to refuse, wanted to split the rice ball and share it. But his body betrayed him. He was so hungry that his hands shook as he unwrapped the food. The first bite nearly made him weep. Real rice, properly cooked, with fish that tasted like home, like normalcy, like a world where food existed beyond survival rations. He ate slowly, making each bite last, aware that Takeda was watching with the satisfaction of a man who had accomplished something important. When Jimmy finished, he found he couldn't speak. The gratitude was too large for words. "Why?" he finally managed. Takeda sat beside him, and for the first time the formal distance between doctor and patient dissolved completely. "Because I see in you what I wish to see in myself. You arrived here full of justified anger. You had every reason to hate all Japanese. Your country has taught you to fear us, to despise us. Your personal experience gave you additional cause." He paused. "Yet you have chosen to see past all of that. You have chosen to recognize humanity in your enemy. This is rare. This is precious. And I will not let such a man starve, if I can prevent it." Sam Carter, who had been pretending to sleep, spoke quietly. "Doc, you're going to die if you keep giving away your food." "We are all going to die," Takeda said matter-of-factly. "The war is going badly for Japan. Supplies are not coming. Eventually this camp will be overrun, or we will all starve. But before that happens, I will save as many lives as I can. I will treat as many patients as possible. I will demonstrate that medicine has no nationality, and mercy has no uniform." The truth of their situation was undeniable. The guards had stopped pretending there would be resupply. The caves that had once housed 300 men now held barely 200. Disease and malnutrition claiming steady victims. Japanese and American alike, they were all dying slowly on this forgotten rock in the Pacific. But in that moment, with the taste of rice still in his mouth, and the knowledge that a man was starving himself to feed an enemy, Jimmy experienced something that transcended hope. It was recognition. Recognition that even in humanity's darkest hour, even when nations committed themselves to mutual destruction, individual humans could choose differently. They could choose compassion. They could choose sacrifice. They could choose to see beyond the uniform, to the person beneath. "I won't forget this," Jimmy said. "When I get home, if I get home, I'm going to tell everyone about what you did here." Takeda smiled, a rare expression that transformed his gaunt face. "Tell them that an enemy became a friend. Tell them that war could not destroy what makes us human. Tell them that a Black American soldier and a Japanese doctor found common ground in a cave in the Pacific. Tell them that mercy is stronger than propaganda." January 15th, 1945. The day began like any other, with Takeda making his morning rounds, checking wounds, dispensing the last fragments of medicine. But at mid-morning, Private David Reynolds, a Marine from the new batch of prisoners, began screaming. The sound echoed through the cave, a raw expression of agony that made everyone freeze. Reynolds had been gut-shot during the fighting on Leyte. The wound had seemed to be healing, but internal damage had been festering. Now peritonitis was setting in, infection spreading through his abdominal cavity, in a process that was invariably fatal without surgery. And surgery was impossible. Takeda had no anesthetic, no surgical instruments adequate for abdominal work, no blood for transfusion, no antibiotics to fight infection. All he could do was administer the last of the morphine and watch Reynolds die. The dying took 3 days, 72 hours of escalating agony as the infection spread, as fever burned through Reynolds's body, as his screams gradually weakened into moans, and finally into the wet, labored breathing of a man drowning in his own fluids. Takeda stayed with him constantly, doing nothing because there was nothing to be done, bearing witness because no man should die alone. On the second day, when Reynolds had a moment of clarity between morphine doses, he grasped Takeda's wrist with surprising strength. "Please," he whispered. "Please make it stop. I can't do 3 more days of this. I can't." Takeda's face showed nothing, but his hand trembled as he smoothed the dying man's hair back from his forehead. "I cannot," he said quietly. "I took an oath to preserve life, not to end it." "Then you're letting me suffer for your principles," Reynolds said, each word costing him enormous effort. "That's not mercy. That's cruelty." After Reynolds lapsed back into unconsciousness, Takeda sat alone outside the cave entrance, staring at the ocean. Jimmy found him there, still able to walk now without the crutch, his leg strong enough to bear weight, though it would never be what it was. "He's right," Jimmy said, sitting beside the doctor. "Letting him suffer for 3 more days? That's not healing. That's torture." "What would you have me do?" Takeda's voice was raw. "Everything I have done here has been to preserve life. Every surgery, every treatment, every supply I have stolen or traded or improvised. All of it to keep men alive. And now you ask me to kill?" "I'm asking you to show mercy," Jimmy said. "Real mercy. The kind that chooses compassion over rules." They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Takeda spoke. "In America, in the camp, I watched a veterinarian euthanize a dog that was suffering. The Americans were kind to animals, kinder than we were to humans. The veterinarian said that mercy sometimes means letting go. But I am not a veterinarian. I am a doctor." "Then let me do it," Jimmy heard himself say. The words came from somewhere deep, from a place that had been transformed by 3 months in this cave, by Takeda's example, by the recognition that mercy had many faces. Takeda turned to look at him, really look at him. And in that gaze was a question that went beyond words. If Jimmy did this, he would carry it forever. The memory of ending a life, even a life begging to be ended, would mark him permanently. Was he prepared for that burden? "Yes," Jimmy said, answering the unspoken question. That night, with Sam Carter as witness and Takeda preparing the injection, Jimmy held Reynolds' hand while the doctor administered an overdose of morphine derived from the last medical supplies Cato had provided. They watched the young Marine's breathing slow, watched the pain leave his face, watched him slip away from a body that had become a prison of suffering. It took less than 5 minutes. When it was over, Reynolds looked peaceful for the first time in 3 days, and Jimmy felt something inside himself break and reform into a new shape, harder and softer simultaneously. "I murdered a man," he said quietly. "You showed mercy to a suffering soul," Takeda corrected. "There is a difference, a small difference, perhaps, but it exists." Sam Carter, who had watched without speaking, finally found his voice. "In a sane world, none of us would be here. Reynolds would be alive. You wouldn't be starving. We wouldn't be prisoners. But this isn't a sane world. And maybe mercy in an insane world looks different than mercy in a sane one." They buried Reynolds the next morning in a shallow grave beside 37 other men who had died in the cave. Japanese and American graves side by side, because death had proven more egalitarian than life. Lieutenant Tanaka led a brief ceremony, reading from a Buddhist text, and Takeda translated it into English for the American prisoners. The words spoke of suffering, of release, of the impermanence of all things. Jimmy stood over the grave of a man whose suffering he had ended, and felt the full weight of what it meant to choose compassion over certainty. He had killed, yes, but he had killed from love, not hate, from mercy, not malice. And somehow, in the arithmetic of this terrible war, that difference mattered. January 27th, 1945. Jimmy was walking now, really walking, without the crutch. The external fixation frame had been removed 3 days earlier in a procedure that hurt more than the original surgery. But the bone had healed. The leg was functional. He had a permanent limp, scar tissue that would ache in cold weather, and muscle damage that would never fully repair. But he could walk. He could stand. He could carry his own weight. That morning, Lieutenant Tanaka announced a reorganization of the camp. The American prisoners were being divided into work details. Half would remain in the cave compound under Takeda's medical supervision. The other half, including Jimmy, would be transferred to a labor detail on the far side of the island, helping build defensive fortifications for the expected American invasion. The separation would be permanent. Tanaka was clear about this. The prisoners would not return to the cave. They would live in a separate camp, under different guards, following different rules. Jimmy understood what this meant. He would never see Takeda again. The man who had saved his life, who had transformed his understanding of mercy, who had taught him that enemies could become brothers, would disappear back into the chaos of war. The transfer happened the next day. 48 American prisoners, including Sam Carter and the Marine Jackson whose leg Takeda had saved, were marched 6 miles through jungle to a coastal compound where 200 other prisoners lived under conditions that made the cave seem luxurious by comparison. The guards here were younger, hardened by combat, and they had not been influenced by Takeda's example of mercy. The first beating happened within hours. A prisoner spoke without permission and received 5 blows with a bamboo rod. A man too weak to work was kicked until he stood. A private who tried to steal a handful of rice was tied to a post and left in the sun for 6 hours without water. Jimmy watched these casual cruelties with a sickness that went beyond physical revulsion. This was the treatment he had expected when first captured. This was the reality that his training had prepared him for. But after 3 months in Takeda's care, after seeing an alternative way, these brutalities felt like betrayal. Not betrayal by the guards, who were simply following standard practice, but betrayal by a universe that had shown him something better and then snatched it away. "This is what I expected," Sam Carter said that first night, lying on the bamboo platform that served as their sleeping area. "The cave was the exception. This is the rule." Jackson, the Marine whose leg was still healing, added his own observation. "My brother was captured by Germans in North Africa. He said the treatment depended entirely on which guards you got. Some were decent. Most weren't. That's how war works. We got lucky with the doctor. We're not lucky anymore." But Jimmy couldn't accept that framework. He had seen something in Takeda that went beyond luck, beyond the random assignment of cruel or kind captors. He had seen principle, chosen compassion, deliberate mercy in the face of cultural pressure to be cruel. And now, watching guards beat prisoners for minor infractions, he understood how rare that was, how precious, how much it cost Takeda to maintain his humanity while surrounded by men who had surrendered theirs. The work details were brutal. 12-hour days digging trenches, hauling stones, building fortifications that everyone knew were useless. The American Navy controlled the seas. American planes owned the sky. Japan was losing, and these defenses would delay the inevitable by perhaps hours. Yet they worked, because the alternative was punishment, and punishment here meant beatings, withholding food, isolation in boxes too small to stand or lie down. 2 weeks into his transfer, Jimmy watched a prisoner die from heat stroke while guards ignored his collapse. The man had been working when his body simply gave out, exhaustion and malnutrition finally overwhelming his will to survive. He fell in the trench they were digging, and nobody moved to help him. When a prisoner finally approached to check on him, a guard shoved him back with a rifle butt. They left the body in the trench for 3 hours before finally allowing prisoners to remove it. No ceremony, no words. Just a corpse added to the growing collection of the dead. That night, Jimmy lay awake and thought about Reynolds, about the mercy killing that had haunted him for 2 weeks. At least Reynolds had died with dignity, with care, with someone holding his hand. This man had died alone in the dirt while people watched. Which was more merciful? A deliberate end to suffering, or nature taking its course while humans did nothing? The questions had no answers, but they revealed something important. Takeda's influence hadn't ended when Jimmy left the cave. The doctor had planted seeds of doubt, of questioning, of moral complexity that continued to grow. Every act of cruelty Jimmy witnessed now was measured against the standard Takeda had set. Every guard who chose violence was compared to the doctor who had chosen healing. And in that comparison, Jimmy found his purpose. He couldn't be Takeda. He had no medical skills, no supplies, no authority. But he could remember. He could bear witness. He could survive this place and tell the world that even in hell, one man had chosen differently. That mercy was possible even when everything conspired against it. That the enemy had shown him more humanity than he had ever expected to find. On the 16th night after his transfer, Jimmy lay on his bamboo platform and whispered a prayer for the doctor he would likely never see again. He prayed that Takeda would survive the war, would return to his family in Osaka, would continue his work of healing in a world that desperately needed it. And he prayed that someday, somehow, he would find a way to repay the debt he owed to the man who had saved not just his leg, but his soul. August 15th, 1945. The war ended with an emperor's voice on the radio, words that most Japanese soldiers had never heard before. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, and across the Pacific, fighting stopped. Guards at the labor camp where Jimmy had spent 7 months lowered their weapons and walked away. No ceremony, no formal surrender. They simply left, disappearing into the jungle as if they had never existed. Liberation came 3 days later, when American Marines landed on Peleliu. Jimmy stood at the compound gate with 200 other prisoners, watching the landing craft approach. He weighed 112 pounds, down from 170 when he had been captured. His leg worked, but the limp was permanent. His body was broken, but his mind was clear. He had survived. The Marines brought food, medicine, and news. The atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the complete collapse of Japanese resistance, numbers that were too large to comprehend, destruction measured in cities rather than casualties. Jimmy listened and felt nothing but exhaustion. The war was over. That was enough. He asked about the cave compound, about the prisoners who had been left behind under Takeda's care. A young lieutenant checked the lists and confirmed that camp had been liberated on August 14th. Most prisoners had survived. The Japanese medical officer had been taken into custody as a prisoner of war and would be repatriated to Japan once processing was complete. Jimmy never saw Takeda again. Their paths, which had intersected so profoundly for 3 months, diverged as completely as if they had existed in different universes. But the impact remained. On the hospital ship that carried him back to Hawaii, then San Francisco, then finally to a veterans hospital in Detroit, Jimmy made a decision. He would become a doctor. Not despite what had happened to him, but because of it. The path was long. The GI Bill paid for college, then medical school at Howard University. 8 years of study while his leg ached and his memories haunted him. He told his story to anyone who would listen, about the Japanese doctor who had saved an enemy's leg when amputation would have been easier. Some believed him. Most did not. The narrative of Japanese brutality was too well established to accommodate stories of mercy. In 1953, while completing his surgical residency, Jimmy received a letter forwarded through the Red Cross. It was written in careful English on thin paper, and it bore a Tokyo postmark. Dr. Hiroshi Takeda had survived the war, returned to his family, and rebuilt his medical practice in Osaka. He wrote that he thought often of the American sergeant whose leg he had saved, wondered if the bone had healed properly, hoped that Jimmy had survived the labor camp. They corresponded for 32 years. Letters that came 3 or 4 times yearly, describing their work, their families, their attempts to find meaning in what they had experienced. Takeda wrote about developing new techniques for treating compound fractures, methods inspired by the improvisation he had practiced in the cave. Jimmy described his practice in a small town outside Detroit, where he treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay, where he explained to young doctors that medicine had no nationality. In 1978, Jimmy traveled to Osaka. He met Takeda's wife, Yuki, and their daughters, now grown women with children of their own. The two men, both in their 60s now, sat in Takeda's garden and spoke of many things. They did not dwell on the war. They had lived beyond it. Takeda died in 1985. Jimmy received the news from Yuki in a letter that took 3 weeks to arrive. The funeral had already happened, but enclosed was a photograph of Takeda at his desk, surrounded by medical texts and certificates, including one from the International Red Cross honoring his treatment of prisoners during the war. On the back, in Takeda's handwriting, were words in English. Mercy transcends borders. Healing has no enemies. Jimmy Lawson practiced medicine until he was 74 years old. He died in 1997, having treated thousands of patients over 5 decades. At his funeral, his daughter read from a journal he had kept throughout his medical career. The first entry, dated September 1946, read simply, "Today I began the path to becoming what he showed me was possible. A healer who sees humans, not enemies. A doctor who understands that saving one life is an act of resistance against the forces that would teach us to hate." The story of these two men, enemy soldiers who became brothers through medicine and mercy, stands as testament to a simple truth. Even in humanity's darkest hours, individual choices matter. Compassion survives. And sometimes, the enemy who saves your life teaches you more about being human than all the friends who stand beside you. Their legacy lives in every doctor who treats patients without seeing nationality, in every person who chooses mercy over hatred, in every moment when someone looks past the uniform to see the human beneath. The war took millions of lives, but in a cave on Pelelu, it also created something unexpected. Proof that healing is stronger than harm, that humanity persists even in hell, and that the bonds formed through mercy can outlast the hatred that starts wars. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.